You so we are ready to receive. So go ahead,
Yeah, you
Anthony.
kicked this off very beautifully a couple of weeks back. You took us to the scriptures, and honestly, that's where I'm going to start, right? I'm going to start from the Corinthians text, Paul's letter to that church, and I'm actually going to also talk about Peter's letter to his church, to the church. So in the first letter Paul wrote to the Corinthians, he says in the fourth chapter, he says, "This then is how you ought to regard us," talking about himself, talking about the other men of God who were with him. He says, "As servants of Christ and as those entrusted with the mysteries God has revealed." That's a functional definition of a steward. Okay. Now, it is required that those who have been given a trust must prove faithful. In the King James, it actually uses the word steward. God, through Paul, is asking the church to regard men of God as stewards. Now, what Pastor said when he introduced this series is that that is not just true of the leaders, Paul, Apollos, Titus. That is also true of you. That this then is how you ought to regard, insert your name, as servants of Christ and as those entrusted with the mysteries God has revealed, as stewards of mysteries. Now it is required. Now, this is the part that's a responsibility, right? With privilege comes responsibility. Now, it is required that those who have been given stewardship must prove faithful. And that's what we're trying to discuss today. Like, hey, there is something that you have, and there's something that you're supposed to do with it. In the letter from Peter to the church, this is First Peter, chapter 4. If you read in verse 10, each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. Wow. There is actually, conversations that, Pastor Chicks and I have where there is a line that sometimes we'll draw about what we're reading, and then there is a higher dimension that we will see that is actually in God's mind about you. Notice in First Corinthians, Paul did not say, "This is what we are." He said, "This is how you ought to regard us." The reason why I think that that is interesting, if you will, is because Paul knows what he is. But he's talking to you to regard him in a certain way. And I think it's so beautiful when you begin to realize that the scriptures never argues with itself. Like when people have an understanding of something, when they are talking, they are not in conflict with one idea versus another. You, son and daughter of God, you are a son. You are a daughter of God. You are a child of God. You are. That is not something you are trying to be. That is something you are. Now he's talking about how you function, right? There's the difference between who you are and how you function. And now he's saying he wants you to function as a steward. One of the things that I was thinking about was Eliezer. Pastor, if there's a thought that you want to jump in, please feel free. Eliezer was
Sure.
yeah, go ahead.
Mm. No, no, no. Go ahead.
Yeah,
I'm
a
just.
servant in God's house. And in God's presenting to us of the Old Testament, we know that it is for examples to us to understand the reality of what we now have. The profit of a household is in the hands of the steward differently than in the hands of the master of the house. And I want to explain how it would have worked back in those days. If a house is doing well, there had to be a good steward in the mix somewhere. If a house is doing poorly, there was usually a bad steward in the mix somewhere. But the responsibility of success or failure of any household was the man of that house, right? So if we are looking at a field and we're looking at 1,000 cattle or 100 horses or this or that, where is this, where are these livestock going to graze? Where are we going to set up camp? Where is Abraham going to establish base as he moves from Ur of the Chaldees to the promised land? He has to follow God, but Eliezer has to follow Abraham. That's the organization. The strategy is Abraham's, the execution is Eliezer's. So Abraham has an idea. I don't want my son Isaac to marry among this group. This crop of people is not the right subset for my son Isaac. So the strategy is I want him to marry from my people's family, my father's land. So the executor of that strategy is Eliezer. So he sends him, go find my son a wife. Now, this is the beauty of being a steward. A steward has the full faith and authority of the master. You, child of God, have the full trust and authority of your Father in heaven in your operation as a steward. So that was the strategy. Go there. So he goes. Now, the nitty gritty, this is where it's really interesting. The nitty gritty of executing anyone's household is not the same thing as the strategy. This is where your unique design comes in. Are you a thinker in the academic sense? Are you a thinker in the feeling sense? Are you a handsy kind of person? Use it. That is your gift. Peter says, use your gift as a servant, right? This is the thing. As a steward of the mystery, when Eliezer goes, he now has to deal with the nitty gritty. So he now says, God of my father Abraham, I need to pick a wife. I don't know how. So I'm going to ask that the woman who does X, Y, Z, all of these things in order, that's the one. And he sets up this arrangement between God and him in his heart. And right away, that woman comes along, right? And if you look at it in the ancient world, the master of the house may have 1,000 coin, maybe 1,000 denarii, some order of finance that he entrusts to the steward. The profit of the household is the strategy of the master, but it's also in partnership with the steward. A bad steward will execute poorly. What if I send my steward to the market to buy me 100 horses? And he doesn't take time to inspect the horses. He buys sick and diseased horses. That's going to affect me. And so God is looking at you with that level of trust. Use your brain. I know that's a very simple summary of this thing